Welcome to UnityNow, the podcast where we discuss unity in the face of division. Inspired by the Unity 2020 plan, we strive to unite Americans by highlighting the middle ground between the two dominant parties and promoting the individual over groups. Each episode, we will bring you exciting, well-informed guests and host nuanced conversations about politically charged subjects. Our goal is to bring an end to the ideological war threatening the collective well-being of this great country.
Please welcome Isaac Saul to the UnityNow podcast. Hi, Isaac. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Toby. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. We appreciate your time. As I mentioned a second ago, you are very busy with your podcast and your newsletter called Tangle, not Tangled. We'll be sure to mention that. And you must not sleep. So tell our listeners and our audience who may not know about your story a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. So I am a political journalist by trade. I actually got my start as a sports reporter at my college newspaper, but worked all over the political news industry for about 10 years as a reporter and editor for a couple different places and freelanced all over. And basically, had a realization 5 or 6 years ago that pretty much anything I wrote or said or did or stories I helped publish were being received by only the people who already kind of bought into the story we were telling. This is mostly because people are kind of curating their own information bubbles and reading a lot of news outlets now that have sort of partisan leans, even in their straight news business. And so, this was kind of before this was public knowledge, I think, or before it was something that everybody sort of understands now, that we're all sort of creating these bubbles for ourselves. But back then I had this sort of idea for a political newsletter or news outfit of some kind that really attempted to bring both sides of the political aisle back under one roof. And about 3 years ago, I put it into motion and I launched a newsletter called Tangle, which essentially covers one debate a day, one big thing people are arguing about in the political news world, and then gives explicit perspectives and opinions from the right, ranging from the center right all the way to the far right, and then from the left, ranging from the center left all the way to the far left. And you get about 3 opinions on each side, and then I write a little mini editorial where I share my own opinion about the story or about some of the arguments. And that's the big chunk of the newsletter every day. So it's just a place where you can go get kind of an explanation about the story out there and then see a bunch of arguments from across the political spectrum about it. And we have a few other fun sections like reader question sections and like a quick hits news section, so you can keep up on all the smaller stories going on. Some stuff like a numbers section and a have a nice day story. And we send the newsletter out every day around noon Eastern. And in the last 3 years, it's really taken off. We have over 35,000 daily readers. We have a podcast now, a website, both of which get, hundreds of thousands of views and listens over the course of a couple months. And it's just really feels like we're building a community of people who are interested in engaging arguments in a good faith way. And so that's what we're about. It's readtangle.com is the plug. If you want to check it out, I would love if your listeners took a look, because I think you guys are on a similar path in a lot of ways.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate that. So we'll just end there. Everyone have a great day. No, I'm just kidding. When I hear stories like this, especially in media, like we could be here for hours because I have so many questions about the thought process, especially like what makes you uniquely different to understand and see what was going on from within these media organizations. And why not try to fix it from within? Like, I know that's a few questions, but, tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, truly the genesis story for me, I think, starts before my political career. I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which for a long time was a bellwether county in PA, which is a bellwether state for how presidential elections usually go. So politics was a huge deal where I grew up, and it was a very politically divided place, my high school, my middle school, my friends across the political spectrum, across the class spectrum, across the race spectrum. It was just like a really diverse place to live politically. And so as I went into college and became a more active voter and citizen, and as I became a professional reporter, I saw my friends who I grew up with like just being torn apart really by the political discourse.
Yeah.
Bridges being burned, and in some few examples, people kind of modeling how to be friends with people across the political spectrum. But, when I talk about what sort of uniquely positioned me to launch this project, it was that I personally feel very politically incongruent. I see very deep flaws in both of the main political parties and in both of the cultures that those political parties are fostering. People always try to pin me down. What are my politics, et cetera? And I just say, like, it's issue dependent. Like, what are we talking about? I think each side has good ideas in certain areas. And it was also that I just have a lot of friends and family who sort of span the political spectrum, which to me helps me sort of humanize a lot of the views that are out there. In terms of stepping out of the kind of quote unquote mainstream media or working under an organization and deciding to go independent, that is really about the structure of how media works right now. I don't think that in a lot of newsrooms, it's possible to shoot totally straight, to be totally independent, because either there's like an institutional bias that you're trying to serve up to your readers, or there are interests in driving page views to drive revenue. You have investors with conflicts of interest. You have advertisers that create conflicts of interest. And I saw and witnessed this throughout my career. So one of the really special things about Tangle is that our newsletter is totally ad-free. We only make money from subscriber support, monthly and yearly subscriptions and donations. And that is how we stay totally independent. So, if we're not giving readers what they're looking for, which is a wide range of political views, then we're going to fail. And that's basically the whole ball game right there.
That makes sense. And that's a recurring trend I think I've heard or noticed with other partners we have with Root Quarterly and Second Look News about the incentives for money for media companies. And do you think they know that they're biased on things and that the incentive is bad for them?
I think that a lot of media organizations are very acutely aware now of the incentives that were driving this sort of sensational clickbait era that we lived through in the 2010s, which was just like, you'll never guess what happens next, because that was like the Facebook era where that was the main driver of traffic, and news organizations had to play to that in order to get traffic. And the more traffic you got, the more revenue you got. We're seeing increasingly a lot of news organizations move toward the subscription model or a mix of subscription model or the kind of nonprofit route, which is like they're funded by donors, big money donors, which again, I think creates all sorts of other problems too. But, in terms of being self-aware of their bias, I think it really depends on the outlet. I think, the kind of papers of record today, like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, I think that they understand their editorial and opinion side has a very clear and overt bias. I think they like to believe that they're all doing really fair down the middle reporting on the straight news side. But I think if you read any of them cover the same story and look at it side by side, it becomes very obvious that somebody has to be doing something that's not down the middle, because they will frame and write a story using vastly different language and resources and statistics. And that's something I've done in Tangle frequently, is put those kinds of stories side by side so people can see, what bias looks like, even in a straight news piece. I think it's really important.
Yeah. And did you ever experience a situation where somebody changed content in a story, or had you reword something that you think reflected a bias? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, one of the things that I actually don't think a lot of people and just normal citizens have knowledge of, and they wouldn't have any reason to know this, is that, the editorial process at all of these places is there are levels and levels to it. And a lot of the bylines you read, a lot of the journalists whose work you're reading, they're at the whim of editors oftentimes, who get the final say on quotes to include or statistics to include or the certain language usage that you have. So, I've been in situations where I really disagreed with how an editor was changing a story that I wrote because I felt like there was, some kind of bias implication that would come through if they used a certain language or cut a certain quote off at a certain point. But, at some point, like, you don't get a say in that when you work for somebody, which is part of the joy of having my own media company now, is that I get to be the person who makes the final say on that. And I think I have a fairly good and fair judgment of, what decisions should be made in scenarios like that.
Yeah, and it's great to see. We have a mission statement that involves, some great things, but we like to see people do solutions for things instead of just, telling them, this is bad, that's bad, but, what do you want to do about it? So you think our political diet is broken, right? And you're trying to fix it now. So how is this going to fix some of these problems, what you're doing? Do we need just a lot more of what you're doing, or, more audience for you guys?
It's a good question. I mean, I'd prefer more audience for us. That would be great. That'd be my choice. Obviously, I want to build this thing out to a point where we have millions of readers and we have people who are coming to us for news, because I think it would be really good. But look, like my fundamental belief and sort of a core thing behind what we're doing is that, like, this is not a kumbaya deal. I'm not trying to say, let's all hold hands and agree. I'm not trying to tell anybody what their politics should be. My point fundamentally is you, the reader, the listener, are not encountering views that you disagree with enough. Full stop. Like, you are living in a bubble based on, like, the people you spend time with, the people you work with, the news outlets you're reading, your social media feed. A lot of people, I think in my world, in the media world, we talk a lot about the liberal bubble, the bubble journalists at the New York Times are living in. That's like a constant navel-gazing discourse that's going on. But to be totally frank, it exists in, like, a working class plumber in rural Pennsylvania. They're in a bubble too, because like, chances are most of the working class trade folks that they hang out with, or the firefighters or the cops, which is like, what I grew up around in Bucks County, like they're all in political bubbles too. It's just on the other side. It's on the conservative side. And it's no better to be in that bubble than it is to be in the elite, quote unquote, urban media bubble. So I just believe, like, we should be encountering those views, these different views more often. I'm very fond of, asking people who think that they're not in a political bubble when the last time they changed their mind about a major political issue was. I mean, if you haven't moved your position on something in, 5 years related to your politics, either like you were right about everything, which would be a miracle, I think, and you would never believe that about anybody else, or you're not really challenging yourself. You're not really encountering views that, are challenging your own perspectives that you have already, which I think is a really big issue in the country right now.
Oh, for sure. And then you got the people that are moving out in farther extreme left and right into their bubbles now. And how do we get them back to the middle because if you tell them that you need to, see something that, is that they don't understand or that is wrong with them, they're gonna be, nope, that person is evil, or that side is evil. How do you get them to listen to a point about the other side that might be right?
Yeah, it's a really hard thing. I think, like, the book that famously deals with that is the Righteous Mind, where Jonathan Haidt writes a lot about, the elephant and the rider and who's really in control, and how our immediate whiplash, emotional, instinctual responses often drive our rationale and not the other way around. So, in my own personal writing, I think this can apply to life everywhere and conversations you have with people you disagree with politically. But what I try to do in my writing is, acknowledge the times when somebody has common ground with me, especially if I'm about to state a point of disagreement. I think like coming forward with, look, I agree that we don't have a ton of clarity about how the 2020 election laws impacted the vote count. However, we also don't have proof that the election was stolen. Like, that is a much more, I guess, feasible way to be received well than telling somebody they're like a total crank and a conspiracy theorist because they think that the 2020 election was stolen. And it's honest too. It's like, at least for me, it is. I'm not faking it. I'm not making that up. There are certain issues where I strongly disagree with somebody, but there are like kernels of common ground there. And I think that's important about the work that you guys are doing, but it's very fundamental to having productive conversations, in my opinion.
Yeah. The argument needs to be not necessarily that, everyone is, knows the same things, but there is middle ground between everyone, a little bit at least, that everybody can potentially agree with some things, like you do with your stories, on Tangle. So yeah, that makes sense. But you have to find things you don't agree with, or how are you ever going to challenge, what you think and like, nobody ever learned anything by ever encountering the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I am a big proponent of understanding at the very least the other side's argument. I mean, aside from asking people issues they've changed their mind on recently, I think another really simple exercise is to just take a moment and ask yourself whether you can actually state the other side's argument, if you can flesh it out clearly, which a lot of people can't do. I mean, I'm currently in Brooklyn. I spend time in upstate New York and West Texas, and I'm actually moving back to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia in a few months. And here in Brooklyn, like a lot of my friends socially, the people I spend time with here are the opposite of the people I spend time with in West Texas. They're overwhelmingly, liberal and in like a very, wealthy professional class. And we'll talk politics, and sometimes I'll ask them, can you tell me, like, do you actually know what the Republican position is on immigration? And it's like, yeah, like immigrants are terrible and we should build the wall. And I'm just like, well, it's really not that simple. There's some more nuance and complexity to it. And when you can't flesh out that position, when like you don't actually understand what most of them are saying, and especially what they're saying at like the legislative level, then you can't really have a conversation at all. And so even if you are encountering stuff that you hate on Tangle, there's a point to it, which is that, like, if you're very cynical, even, you could use it as a way to understand the other side's argument so you could defeat that argument. I think most people use it as a way to just really make sure they have a clear understanding of what people are arguing across the political spectrum, because not enough people do.
Right, and that's going to be my new strategy. I do use like Twitter to understand what people are talking about, but not to get the truth about, some news stories. So now I'll see what's trending, and I'll go to your newsletter and see what you're saying about this, because it seems like you write about everything going on politically right now. Is there a situation you're not writing about, like, that you haven't covered?
Well, we try to go where the conversations are happening, and those conversations span everything from, the culture war to legislative debates to foreign affairs and international stuff. And I am very keen on just saying, like, I don't know. I don't use the space I get in the newsletter every day to get on my soapbox. There are certain areas that I'm not really comfortable writing about, and I can, take what's being discussed and sort of put it in a political frame, like bring it to a world I understand, or just say like a couple of these arguments seem kind of spurious to me. You can make up your mind. Some days it's like stuff that's right in my strike zone that I feel really comfortable writing about, that I feel like, maybe I'm not an expert on, but I'm very knowledgeable about, and then I express kind of a strong opinion on it. So, I don't shy away from covering anything. We go into abortion and trans issues, and we also cover, inflation and the Build Back Better Act and what's happening with Sweden and Finland trying to join NATO. I mean, we really do try and do it all. So, I think as long as like you come to those topics with some humility about your own position, then it's easy to cover them honestly and make it informative for readers who are just trying to learn a little bit.
Yeah, and that it's great. It's a great resource I'm going to now use going forward. I did look at the abortion newsletter, but I didn't get in through it. It was I think you said it was like 5,000 words at the top.
Yeah,
I didn't get through it all. Yeah,
that was one of our longest newsletters we've ever published, which again I think just speaks to how much kind of tact it requires to cover something that is that sensitive, and that is an issue where, like, I don't know. I fall on the pro-choice side. That's just like my personal view on that independent issue. And I think there's like a lot of space on that side of the issue. There's a huge spectrum on the pro-choice side. And my position that I took in the newsletter was actually pretty strong because abortion's something I know a lot about. I'm Jewish. I grew up in a reformed Jewish space, but spent time in yeshiva in Israel and have operated in a lot of really religious social spaces. So I just like have heard and discussed this issue a lot. And I just took a pretty strong stance that I think Roe v. Wade being struck down, independent of whether it's the right legal ruling, which I actually think it might be, I think is going to be like a very bad thing for the country and the culture wars around abortion. I think it's going to make a lot of stuff worse, which is kind of what I wrote about. And, I was shocked. I was very nervous publishing that newsletter, and I was shocked to see how many people, pro-life and pro-choice people, wrote in and just like express support for me honestly presenting my opinion, even if they, really strongly disagreed. There was a lot of that, which I think is, just like to the point that like these conversations are possible. There are ways to do it that are respectful and honest, that, allow people to have differences and sort of operate shoulder to shoulder still, which I think is really important.
Yeah, that makes it that's why what you're doing is not just good for everybody. It's a very brave thing to do because, you have your opinions in there, and you're being honest as well. And instead of just going in for your tribe or, the tribe maybe you used to be in or, somebody's tribe. So yeah, that's dangerous. Did you get any, really bad responses, either Twitter or whatever it may be?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they come in most days, whether it's people telling me that I'm, because I express some modicum of understanding about the anti-abortion side, that I'm interested in, deciding what women do with their body and I'm a monster, or people writing in from the pro-life side saying that, I support the murder of children and how could I be a moderate or independent or nonpartisan if like I like killing babies, you get that stuff. And, my rule generally is I try and respond to every reader email I get. So I will give, no matter what the comment is, I will give people like one really like take a breath, respond to them in the best, like present the best form of myself that I possibly can, regardless of what they said to me. Because, I think a lot of people are used to screaming into the void on the internet and they forget that there's like a person behind there sometimes. And I've had enough interactions where somebody has said like some intentionally cruel, mean stuff to me. and I've responded and just said like, hey, listen, like I spent a lot of time on this newsletter and like I've put some thought behind this. Here's what I actually think. Like, I'm happy to engage you in like a dialogue about this conversation, but if you talk like that, it's just going to make it impossible because it makes me, puts up my defenses. And then, half the time I'll get a response that's like, oh my God, I can't believe somebody actually read this. I'm really sorry. It just made me so frustrated to read what you said. And then we'll like jump into an actual dialogue about, what's going on. So that gives me some hope too. I think like, a lot of people are just, they're used to that, to screaming into the void.
Yeah, and do you think you'll be able to keep up with that kind of process to try to respond to everyone that says you're nuts or they hate you?
I am right now with about 35,000 subscribers. I am like typically 6 or 7 days behind on reader feedback. So if my dream comes true and we're writing to 1 million people one day, I imagine I'm going to have like a staff to help me handle that, which will make things complicated a little bit. But for now, I'm enjoying that it's still like an intimate enough experience that I get to be on the front lines and actually reply as myself. But no, it's not easy and it's time consuming, and that part of the business is probably not scalable, but I'm going to try and do it for as long as I can for sure.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's an honest response, and I think it's a good endeavor to try and to keep up with that. But there's no way you can keep up with, because you're definitely gonna hurt some feelings in what you're doing. I mean, there's no way around it. You give opinions from both sides and how people are saying things from both sides, and then your own opinions, and so you're always gonna get some of the backlash potentially.
Yeah, definitely.
You still do it. Yeah. So speaking of the backlash, there was a story, I guess, that you told about a time in, I believe it was high school, where you used offensive language, and then so you went back later and covered that situation. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So I wrote a newsletter edition that I guess was a response addressing, for lack of a better term, cancel culture and the kind of redemptive nature of our politics right now, or lack thereof, really more specifically. And, I wrote about how when I was in high school, growing up in the area that I was in, which while we were near places like Trenton, New Jersey and Philadelphia that had a lot of racial diversity, my actual high school and the specific county I lived in did not. We have a ton of class diversity, and with that, a ton of political diversity, but it was a predominantly white school. And when I was in high school, kids threw around the N-word, rapping to music and talking to each other like our favorite hip-hop guys did. And we used a lot of gay slurs as kids. We called stuff gay. We used the F-word to refer to kids we didn't like. And I did that until I was, 17, 18 years old, and really until I went to college at the University of Pittsburgh in Western PA. And I was lucky in a lot of ways because I lived in an era where all those comments and that kind of stuff wasn't going on social media. It wasn't being blasted out on Facebook and Twitter and TikTok. Because if I had those services at the time, I definitely would have made a lot of mistakes. And, the crux of the issue for me was that as I got older, I was really lucky also to have people in my life who confronted me about it, who were like, dude, you sound like an idiot. And like, you're not just like ignorant and it's not just offensive, but like you also are just making yourself look like an asshole, basically.
Oh, wow.
And that was like a really powerful and transformative experience for me to get confronted with that from, friends, from people who were, older than me. And it gave me an opportunity to really learn and understand. And there was little reason for how I acted besides the fact that, it was the way other kids around me talked and I thought it was cool and I wanted to fit in. And,
right.
that's there's a cop out there in a lot of ways where it's like there were other kids in my school who didn't talk that way. And, I can't say anything except like I take responsibility for that. But the truth is that experience and going through that evolution gave me a lot of sympathy for, people who get, especially young people who get their public words broadcast across the internet and get crushed for it and lose, career prospects or opportunities at colleges. That specific newsletter, I think, was inspired by a story of a college cheerleader. I think she was at the University of Tennessee, maybe, who made some dumb TikTok video or something where she like bought a Cadillac and like was rapping along in the Cadillac and dropped the N-word, and it got reported to her school and she lost her scholarship. She got kicked off the cheerleading team. And, I'm sort of like of two minds of it, where it's like, on the one hand, there's sort of this principle that conservatives and liberals kind of agree on of like, you're responsible for your actions and actions have consequences. And that's like a very American cultural kind of attitude. And then there's another part of me that's just like, should we really be destroying this 18-year-old girl's college education because of this? Like, there must be a better solution in terms of like bringing these people into the fold and teaching them that what they're doing is wrong. And I think, more than anything, that kind of stuff drives people to the extremes. I think there's an abundance of research and anecdotal evidence that isolating and shunning people for actions is far more likely to push them further into their ideological corners or further into, whatever space produced their moral offense, than it is to usher them into like a more respectful and decent society or a more respectful and decent social status. And and so that was kind of like the story, which was definitely one of the more controversial things that I've written. I mean, it drew a huge range of responses from people who are really loved it to people who thought that I was like just, making a preemptive apology for stuff that I was worried about coming out about me or something, which honestly was just total nonsense. But, like there was a very wide range of response to it. And, I think it speaks to how people are feeling right now. There's a lot of people who want justice for certain violations of decorum or decency or whatever you want to call it. And there is a wide range of views about what justice should look like, whether it should be redemptive or punitive. And I'm definitely more in the redemptive camp. And I think that applies to everything across the spectrum.
Wow. That's interesting. And I think, thank you for sharing that. It makes sense, tells us a little more about why you're doing what you're doing. It's that introspection, I think, relates to everyone we meet in this arena who's been able to pull themselves away from, Magistan and Wokistan or extreme left and right, whatever you want to call it, their bubbles, their tribes, and see things with an open mind. That first thing maybe all of us has to do is admit that I have made mistakes and admit that therefore everyone else will make mistakes. And that's how you learn how to do different things, is make those mistakes. Because, you said that there were kids in your high school that they weren't using that kind of language. But it's not as if you could, know exactly why every single one of them wasn't using that language. Maybe they were using it, but you never heard of it. Or maybe they were just not in the same circle of people, or maybe their parents did like flush it out and make sure they were going to be accountable if they use that sort of language. But we all hit these things at different points in life, right? And to put all of this on display for every one of us when we're like 18 or 20, and now we can see everything everybody does, it's just not the way human beings were meant to evolve, I don't think.
Yeah, no, definitely not. And, I think that the example that I used in that story about the cheerleader was something kind of about, I think there was maybe like a year of time that passed between when her initial transgression transpired, and I think the piece is like a year and a half old or something, so I'm a little foggy on the precise details, but I do know that there was like a good amount of time elapsed, and now what we're seeing is a lot of people who are in their late 20s or early 30s have an online record that goes back into their teens, and they're having stuff dug up on them from when they were 16 or 17 or 18, 10 years ago that's being used to, attack their career and their livelihood and their personhood now in terms of, what their character is. And I feel pretty strongly that I don't think that's like a good, healthy dynamic in society. I think I'm repulsed by a lot of the things that I did when I was 16 and 17 now. And, I think a lot of people feel that way. And so, I don't need to be reminded, and I certainly don't need to be punished for it now, 16 years later. That's just like my personal view on it. And I've heard some good counter arguments, but they're not totally convincing to me. And, I also want to just call out something you said that I think is interesting about like the pulling each other from the Magistan and the Wokistan and like the far left and far right. I understand that like the work that you guys are doing is really trying to carve out like this more moderate centrist space, at least from what I've seen, on your website and listening to an episode or two of the podcast. I am like pretty intent on I don't want to do that for people with Tangle, and that is not part of my goal. Like I think we're doing work in tandem that really plays off each other, but it's not like foundational to the end game, because I think some people who exist in the far left or the far right, they actually they can be right on certain issues, and centrism or moderation is an ideology of itself, just the way being a heterodox is. I think there's like a joke that I don't even remember where I first heard it, but I tell it all the time about how like Democrats want to build a bridge, Republicans say it costs too much, centrists say all right, let's just build it halfway, and it's like okay, like that's not the best solution, right? So like regardless of what it is, I mean, one issue that I'm like very extreme on, that I've like super far left politics about, is incarceration. Like I don't sort of on that redemptive note, just like a consistent ideology that I have is like, I don't really think putting human beings in 8x8 foot cages for 20 years is actually a good way to improve society or help them. I don't think it works. I think like if you think about it for more than 5 minutes, it's actually insane that we do it. But most of America would view that as being like super extreme perspective. And I actually think I could win that argument a lot. And so I don't like, I don't want to just dismiss people who exist on the fringes, because I think some of that is going to end up being true in 20 or 30 years. But I do think that we should give those perspectives a high degree of scrutiny, especially when they don't exist near the middle, because a lot of the times, when you take extreme positions, they have really dangerous consequences. And so that's just like, I just want to make that clear about Tangle, that I have readers who operate in the far left and the far right, and they still can trust the news that we're producing. I think in part because I'm not trying to force them into the middle. I think they're probably wrong to be out on the fringes, but that's, kind of beside the point for me.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that. And it's important for us to be careful about what we're trying to do as well. We're trying to highlight the middle ground that does exist for most people and not change everything. We know there's still going to be extreme left and right and people still on the left and right, and that's okay. There needs to be a pull that's always going to be, involved, and a pull between the left and right on everything. Like you just said, the bridge, like we need to find a way to build that bridge when it's complete and we can actually use the damn thing, right?
Yeah.
Instead of just saying, well, there's always got to be a middle ground between everything. Yeah, that's not possible. And what we're, like I said, we're trying to highlight where there is middle ground. And, like in the case of Unity 2020 that Brett Weinstein started, that kind of helped us get our start. The idea was to show Americans that you actually have a lot more in common than you believe that you do, and that you don't need to vote for that guy just because you think it'll beat that guy, and vice versa. And it's like, we should actually come together and decide on the people that we really want to represent us and vote for those people and have a way to do that, instead of this popularity contest, instead of us all believing that the presidency has this big effect on us, sort of thing, and understand how politics works and how these people should actually represent all of us Americans, and not just, try to get my tribe to beat your tribe and my party to beat your party.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great space to operate in for sure.
Yeah. And so, man, we're running a little short on time, I think. I really wanted to touch on 2,000 Mules really quick, if we could, because I did read that story that you published about Dinesh D'Souza's movie, 2,000 Mules. And I think anyone who watches our podcast or it needs to be introduced to your newsletter and your podcast needs to hear this if they are on the Republican side and they heard about this and just thought, yep, that's right, election was stolen, I knew it. Right? Because you go through what they got right, what they got wrong, and really how you should look at the movie, right? And what the incentives were.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I sort of made a name for myself in 2020 reporting on a lot of allegations about election fraud. One of the things that happened was I had like a very viral election fraud thread where I was just sort of investigating, using some of my reporting skills to chase down a few of the allegations that were out there, just from being a politics reporter and voting a lot and spending a lot of time talking to election experts and politicians and reading legislation. I have a pretty good grasp of how elections work. And for most allegations of voter fraud, if you have that understanding, it's pretty easy to see what's going on. But there's also stuff that's out there that's challenging. There are also things out there that are examples of real fraud, and there are things out there that lack so much evidence that it's sort of impossible by design to disprove them, except to just say that like there is no real evidence being presented for this claim. So 2000 Mules was a super interesting movie to me because, when the election first happened, the initial story of the stolen election was mostly centered around Dominion voting systems. That was kind of what Donald Trump and his allies were talking about, was that there was this election software that was flipping votes, that had turned votes overnight while everyone was sleeping in a bunch of the swing states, or had added votes to Joe Biden. And this was how the election was stolen. And over time, in a really interesting kind of political sleight of hand, that view and that initial theory has basically been taken out to the barn. And now there's sort of something that had replaced it, which was this idea that it wasn't necessarily that the votes were tampered with, but that the election was stolen because a bunch of private money came in from Mark Zuckerberg to a lot of, Democratic leaning districts to their election centers, which is true. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I think is something to debate and flesh out. But it's true that there was a lot of private money floating around, or that, social media companies basically buried the Hunter Biden story, also true. And that by doing that, they maintained a certain level of support for Biden that helped him narrowly win across a few states. Mm-hmm. And so, that's a very different argument than there were like the votes were counted incorrectly or were falsified. Those are like two really different things.
Right.
I would put the latter argument much more in like the Hillary Clinton 2016 camp of like, James Comey announcing this investigation in my emails 20 days before the election ruined me, or the media reporting on WikiLeaks destroyed my candidacy, which I think a lot of Republicans rightly see as like a very weak excuse for losing. And I think that excuse is a lot more similar to the Facebook stuff or the Hunter Biden stuff. But the 2000 Mules documentary sort of returns to this idea that there were basically illegal votes being counted. This is not about, it's not about the vote count being manipulated or broken in some way. It's that Democrats were paying these 2,000 people across swing states to deliver ballots in a fashion that was illegal based on state laws, and were stuffing ballots in their drop boxes. It's a pretty long piece, so there's a lot to go through there, and I'm happy to get into it. I've certainly got time to, and if there are specific issues that you want to touch on, but I think the general thrust of it for me is that the film comes up way short of actually proving that it is proving what it says it is. There's quite a few sort of moments where the movie has an opportunity to present hard evidence, and if what they're saying is true, would have the hard evidence to sort of supply the information to show that there was this network of people stuffing ballot boxes across Georgia and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And they never do it, which is just, I think, pretty much tells the story. To me, the ultimate kicker is that the Georgia election investigative, office has had to subpoena the data that they say they have, the information they say they have, to investigate the claims that they're making, that they won't even turn the information they say they have over to law enforcement, which, if what they're saying is true, is very straightforward cell phone data that is attached to specific citizens, which would be like one of the easiest open and shut cases I could imagine. I mean, it's like names, phone numbers, addresses. We go knock on doors. Where were you on the night of whatever? And if they're on tape stuffing ballots, they're getting arrested for fraud. And they don't do that. They have no interest in getting law enforcement involved, which is very curious. And the data that they have turned over to law enforcement has not even been sufficient to open an investigation, let alone prosecute anybody for voter fraud or election fraud, which happens all the time across the country. So needless to say, I think the film is misleading in a lot of ways, and I try and break down sort of point for point how that happens and what they're doing. And I think when you see it laid out like that, it becomes a lot more obvious what's going on.
Yeah, and I've described this many times on this show, and my team knows this. I came from rural Indiana, right-wing bubble, and voted Trump in 2016, and it was between then and 2020 where I really kind of opened my eyes and learned my lesson. And so I still catch myself having sort of a conservative bend when something like this comes out, but I can still see, like when the movie started, it was a round table of conservative people. Like, okay, guys, if you really wanted to start this out with people really taking you seriously from the other side, why did you start with a bunch of people that they know are conservative or pundits? Larry Elder and Charlie Kirk and people like that. It's like it starts there. But then you point out something like, with supposedly 2,000 mules, but up to potentially 54,000 mules, only one person came forward. They only have one witness that, these people did something so wrong, but nobody said, oh man, I feel bad about that. And they came forward. But you have all these other cases that you show that people did come forward, even people that came forward inside that were doing those things for the side that won in that election.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I'm glad you point that out. I mean, to me, it's a very potent point about the whole thing, like they talk in the film, and I give, Dinesh credit for it. He talks about how one of the last big high profile election fraud cases was a Republican candidate for Congress in North Carolina. Right. And in that case, people on his staff testified under oath against him, which is normally how it goes, because most people are kind of allergic to cheating to win. And in this case, the movie wants you to believe that 54,000 people participated in a federal crime to throw a presidential election. And, not one of them has a family member who got wind of what they did and reported them to the police. I mean, literally not one. They bring forward one anonymous witness who doesn't even cop to being one of the mules. She just says that she witnessed somebody being paid for what she assumed was the work of, stuffing ballots in New Mexico, which was a state that Biden won pretty handedly. I guess it got close at the end, but it was just like there's just a number of sort of very obvious questions of like, you have 2,000 people, you say, on camera with cell phone data attached to them committing these crimes, and you have a team of journalists working on this story. You have a whole production crew. You couldn't get like one of them to either admit to doing it on camera, even with like a James O'Keefe style sting operation, who he was a producer on the movie, and he couldn't get anybody, and you couldn't get a family member to talk about it. You couldn't get a friend. You couldn't get anybody to file a police report. You couldn't get any police or investigative committee to actually investigate it based on the evidence you were giving them. Something just doesn't add up at that point, where it's like, these are not non-powerful people. Like you said, the people behind this movie are a lot of wealthy, famous, well-known conservative pundits with lots of resources at their fingertips and teams at their fingertips. And the fact that they couldn't do that, I think, basically speaks for itself.
Agreed. So, yeah, definitely everyone needs to check out your newsletter on that for sure. If you believe in the movie, definitely go read that. So what's the future, look for political news going forward? What do you think about that?
I oscillate between being very optimistic and very cynical. I think today you're catching me at a time when I feel pretty optimistic. I think a lot of people recognize right now that our discourse is broken. They recognize that we need something better. They recognize that we are living in these sort of information bubbles that you and I have been talking about. And I think it's in the interest of media companies to diversify their staffs, the political diversity they have on staff, the content that they're covering. I think it's in their interest to present really balanced, straightforward news to the best of their ability, fair news to the best of their ability, because people are fed up with it. The industry's struggling. There are so many motives. We talk a lot about the incentives that used to exist for clickbait and sensationalism, and a lot of them are going away, and the incentives are changing, and a lot of independent writers and media companies like myself are starting to succeed outside the bubble, which means that those media companies are going to lose talent for people who want to go independent and make more money and reach a bigger audience. And all of that, I think, is going to motivate them to look inward and reform some things. And so I'm hopeful that happens. I think it'll be a slow process, and I'm sure it won't be something that happens overnight or without some painful days and weeks and years. But at the very least, I think we're already at a place now compared to 10 years ago where it's a lot easier to access, independent content and independent writers and thinkers who are operating in a way where, their views are not being stuffed into certain boxes. They can speak freely and open-mindedly about the stuff they're covering, and I think that's a really good start. So I'm hoping we've got some momentum, but yeah, it won't be easy.
Yeah, I tend to agree. We talk about censorship. We've had some episodes about censorship before, and one of our episodes got censored by YouTube about the C word and the I word. And, there is so many more information now that people can find. Breaking Points has been successful now. But like CNN Plus, not so much, right? So that independent, the need for that independent source, you can see, I think, right there where CNN Plus, fell 4 or 5 weeks after it was launched, and that's the leading news organization supposedly in the world, or it used to be when I was a kid. So, yeah, I tend to agree with you.
Yeah, no, I think it's just proof that people don't want more of that same style. They're
right.
looking for something else. And, Yeah, for something like that, an endeavor like that to fail with so many other sort of independent subscription based news outlets succeeding is definitely indicative of where we are, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. So before we go, tell us what you're working on. I hear you're working on something with Ashton Kutcher. Is that correct?
That was actually my old job. That was the last gig that I had before I started Tangle. Speaking of solutions and looking for people starting solutions, we ran a news company called A Plus that was a sort of solutions-based, solutions-oriented news outlet where we tried to write stories and talk to people who are fixing stuff. And I ran the political vertical there, which was a lot of that, finding people who were helping and not hurting, which isn't always easy to do in politics. But look, my goal is to get Tangle in front of as many people as possible. I'm laser focused on that right now. We have our own podcast up and running. We have the newsletter at readtangle.com and the website. And, the next few months, I think there's some stuff in the works for us on trying to get some events up off the ground or some speaking engagements out there to sort of just like hit the road and talk to people face to face, which I think would be really cool and something I'm really excited about. And we have a good model, I think, and I think it's going to be critical for the midterms coming up. It's election season now, so we're just getting in the throes of that, and we're going to try and make sure that we're out there and readily available for people heading into November, because I think this kind of resource is really important for voting and understanding what's happening in the country.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, you're going to be the first place I go for any election news, for sure. It's like you're not a fact check necessarily, but maybe you're like a political check or something like that. Maybe Twitter needs to have their stories politically checked with you, something like that.
Yeah, we like to say it's like an actual holistic look at what's happening, in the media space, in the political space, across the media spectrum. And, this way you don't have to go to 20 different websites in a day. You can just read one Tangle and you'll get a pretty good vibe of what's going on out there.
All right. So it's the website's readtangle.com, right?
Yep, that's it.
People can go there, check out the newsletter, subscribe, become a member. And then you have a premium membership on there as well, right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And then is the podcast, is that just a spoken version of the articles?
Yeah, so the podcast typically Monday through Thursday is me just sort of reading and riffing on the newsletter right after it's published. So the podcast comes out about an hour after the newsletter does. And then I try and do interviews. I shoot for maybe one a week, but I'm not great at that cadence. So it's usually maybe one every 2 weeks or so, where I just sit down with some people in the political world across the spectrum, talk about some relevant issues. And those happen to be, honestly, a lot of people's favorite episodes is the conversation ones, because I give people a lot of space to just sort of speak their mind and probe their views a little bit. And that's really fun for me and part of the gig that I really enjoy. So.
Wow. Yeah, you really don't sleep, do you? So.
Yeah. I definitely need more hours in the day. That's for sure.
Yeah, you're a real live bot. Maybe you're not a Twitter bot. You're a real live bot. You're not human. All right, Isaac Saul, we appreciate your time so much on the UnityNow podcast. Everybody should go check out your stories and your newsletters and your website. We'll send everybody in, the links in the episode description, and we hope we can help you guys going forward.
Yeah, let's keep in touch. Thanks so much, Toby. I appreciate it.
All right, Isaac, thanks so much.